Thank you, YouGov, for sponsoring this video. In 1741, Virginia Governor William Gooch wrote in his status report that the poor potter is dead, and the business of making pots and pans is of little advantage to his family and as little damage to the trade of the mother country. He was specifically referring to a Yorktown area pottery operation that he had first noted in 1732 and that he had repeatedly said made low-quality products that were no threat to the import of manufactured goods from England. But Governor Gooch was lying, and William Rogers was anything but poor. The story of the poor potter of Yorktown and how his business represented the growing American desire for independence deserves to be remembered. But before we talk about colonial pottery, I want to thank the good folks at YouGov for sponsoring this video. YouGov's a great way to make extra cash, and darn it, with prices going up, everybody needs a little bit of extra cash. And it's also a way for you to express your opinion, because darn it, your opinion deserves to be remembered. It's really easy to sign up, and once you're a member, you can take a number of different polls. It might be over pop culture or politics or brand names. I took one about pets because all good History Guy fans know that I'm a cat person, and the best part is that you actually get paid for registering your opinion. You just take these short surveys or polls, and you earn points, and you get stuff. They're really easy to do, and you can do them on your computer or devices, and it's actually a lot of fun. Plus, you get to have your voice heard. You can do the surveys when you're, say, waiting in line at the store. I tend to do them when I'm procrastinating or just need to take a break from writing history videos. When you take the surveys, you earn points. You use the points to buy gift cards. You use the gift cards to buy crazy things to put on your YouTube set. So click on the link in the video description, take surveys, and earn cash with YouGov. Over the 17th and 18th centuries, England passed a series of laws known as the Acts of Trade and Navigation, which sought to develop, promote, and regulate English sea trade. Included in the regulations were rules about colonial trade. In general, foreigners participated in colonial trade was curbed, and rules were set up to best benefit the mother country. It required trade to be carried on English ships, the employment of English and colonial sailors for 75% of the crew, and enumerated what kinds of products could be exported from colonies, and to whom. The rules were built around the economic theory of mercantilism and were aimed at keeping the benefits of trade within the empire and to prevent the loss of profits, gold and silver, to foreigners. England expected her colonies to provide raw materials in exchange for the guaranteed market to refrain from production. Manufactured goods were meant to be made in England and sold back to the colonies. The colonists were never terribly interested in existing only as a market for British goods, and from the beginning, American entrepreneurs were interested in making their own goods within the colonies, both to make their own fortunes and to increase the colonies' independence, since the acts required that colonists and the colonial economy rely heavily upon the mother country. Actual economic damage from the acts was small. In a 1995 study, 89% of historians and economists agreed that costs imposed on colonists by the trade restrictions of the Navigation Acts were small. However, the political impact was more serious. Opposition to the Navigation Acts played a large role in the American Revolution, especially after changes in the 1760s, such as the Sugar Act. The 1760s would see resentment begin to boil over, but for decades, colonists had been resisting English laws to their own benefit. English officials opposed numerous Virginia acts that encouraged manufacturing as having very ill consequence to the dependence that colony ought to have on this kingdom. Entrepreneurs began starting businesses to produce manufactured goods as the population in the colonies grew, especially to serve growing communities that created demand for the goods. Cottage industries such as forging tools in iron mills and processing grain grew into full manufacturing. Sir William Gooch was a British Army officer, born in 1681, who became the Royal Lieutenant Governor of Virginia in 1727. In practice, he was the only governor of Virginia, as the actual governors, Lord Orkney and Lord Albemarle, remained in England and had little to do with governing the colony. Gooch had numerous accomplishments as governor, including the Tobacco Inspection Act of 1730, which reduced fraud and increased tobacco quality, increasing demand for the colony's most important export. In 1732, he sent the first of a series of reports on manufacturers within Virginia, a report he made almost annually afterwards. Included was a brief note on pottery manufacture. As to manufacturers set up, there is one poor potter's work for coarse earthenware, which is of so little consequence that I dare say there had not been 20 shillings worth less of that commodity imported since it was set up than there was the year before. Later reports located the poor potter's factory in Yorktown, but its mention was always accompanied by assurances that what pottery was made was too low quality to compete with British imports. Only the poorest families bought the potter's work, and in 1736 Gooch said the potter continued without any great improvement. For most of 2 centuries, historians and archaeologists assumed that early American manufacturing was virtually non-existent or low quality even where it existed. Archaeological finds in the 20th century upended that assessment. By at least 1720, pottery was being manufactured in Yorktown, and not just earthenware, often lead-glazed, but fire-salt-glazed stoneware. Several kilns were in operation along with a large building for manufacturing the vessels. Gooch, of course, could not have been ignorant of the works or the quality of the goods it produced. The only explanation is that Gooch, for whatever reason, tolerated the production and deliberately downplayed it to the English government. Gooch was not the only colonial governor to downplay colonial manufacturing, and likely other governors were just as happy to turn a blind eye. Decades later, Benjamin Franklin would advise his son William, royal governor of New Jersey, to admit reports about pottery making in the colony. Reporting that colonial pottery was of low quality, Ben went on, are very satisfactory here, and induced Parliament to despise and take no notice of the Boston resolutions. Submitting these carefully wordsmithed reports that essentially protected colonial manufacturing on this scale might have served a colonial governor's political or even personal financial interests, but it was tantamount to rebellion. It went against the foundations of the British economic plan. The works at Yorktown were owned by William Rogers. Rogers is largely absent from the historical record. The only known surviving piece of his handwriting is on a receipt from 1720. He may have been born in the 1680s across the Thames from London, in the traditional pottery centers of Southwark and Lambeth. He seems to have been a brewer by trade and arrived in Yorktown around 1710. Established in 1691, Yorktown was already a large community for the era and had 50 or more buildings, along with a thriving local economy. The first thing he did was open up a brewery. In 1711, Rogers acquired the lots where he built his pottery enterprise. Though he doesn't seem to have been a potter himself, he lived on the lots and must have been closely involved with production. Rogers was busy in Yorktown and would eventually involve himself in a large number of enterprises. He was likely working on his pottery factory in 1718, and around 1720, when it began production, he was also involved in a store in Yorktown. He built a warehouse on the waterfront and entered into partnerships with English merchants. In 1730, he bought a 90-ton sloop and eventually owned at least 4 sailing ships and traded across the Atlantic. He dabbled in growing grain and raising livestock, and in the 1730s was contracted to build a prison for the county. By 1724, he was on the rise. He was referred to as a merchant instead of as a brewer in local records and began importing slaves. He owned 36 when he died, along with indentured servants to work at his various enterprises. By 1725, he was selling large amounts of pottery, as evidenced by a suit against Alexander Worley, who was supposed to transport a large shipment of pottery to Maryland. Court records seeking small debts show that he sold pottery all over Virginia and Maryland in the 1720s, and eventually sold pottery as far as New England and the West Indies. Archaeological work examining the pottery he produced makes it clear that what he made was almost indistinguishable from the pottery made in England. When he opened his pottery works around 1720, Alexander Spotswood was the lieutenant governor, administering the colony from nearby Williamsburg. Spotswood made no mention of Rogers' activities to England. Hugh Drysdale succeeded Spotswood in 1722, and he also made no mention of Rogers' enterprise, instead maintaining a silent approval. Only William Gooch even mentioned Rogers, and then only as the poor potter. But Rogers was far from poor. By 1734, when he reached the apex of his wealth, his pottery operation was likely the largest pottery operation in all of British North America. Archaeological evidence shows he made at least 23 types of earthenware and stoneware, including milk pans, bowls, mugs, colanders, porringers, churns, and chafing dishes. When he died in 1739, the inventory of the factory included 26 dozen quart mugs, 60 dozen pint mugs, 4 dozen bird bottles, 3 dozen lamps, and dozens of milk pans, bottles, small dishes, and cream pots. Jane Sundberg, cultural resource management specialist at the Colonial National Historical Park in Yorktown, said the high quality of the pottery is astonishing. Contrary to Gooch's reports, it is clear that the operation significantly competed with imported pottery, not just in Virginia, but in trade across the New World. Before 1750, Yorktown was the preeminent Virginia port, exporting more tobacco and foodstuffs than anywhere else. Rogers was sworn in as a member of the county militia, likely as a lieutenant, and promoted to a captain in 1734. The same year, he identified as William Rogers, Gent, evidence that he had entered the tiny top echelon of colonial society. He owned a coach and 4 coach horses, silver spurs, a pair of pistols, and a sword with a silver hilt. He had a large set of silver utensils, drinking cups, and a teapot, and his house contained valuable walnut, cherry, and japanned furniture, as well as a clock. He came to own a significant amount of land within Yorktown, as well as Williamsburg. He was certainly one of the wealthiest men in the county, and possibly in the colonies. He lived in a house on the same lot as his pottery factory, but in 1739 he purchased a lot at the edge of town and had a house built there, though he died before he ever lived there, although his widow lived there for the rest of her life. No personal papers survived, making it difficult to know who William Rogers was as a person. Seems to have been somewhat educated, owned a reasonably large library, as well as over 90 pictures, including prints with gilt frames and maps. He served in a handful of political positions, including the surveyor of the town's streets and landing, meaning that he was in charge of street repair. Rogers died in 1739. The same year, Gooch told the Board of Trade that Rogers' pottery enterprise was unworthy of your lordship's notice. The factory seems to have run for several years afterwards, to at least 1745 and possibly until 1760. In the years that followed, the lots were sold, and in 1770 they were described as the pothouse lots. But the centuries between their heyday and the modern era meant that their importance faded, and the only remaining references were those disparaging ones in Gooch's report. Many historians and archaeologists thought that American manufacturing in the colonial era was poorly developed, small, and usually of inferior quality. It wasn't until the 20th century that finds began to counter that notion. Especially interesting were large deposits of pottery fragments. At least 140,000 fragments attributed to the Rogers factory have been found. In 1966, a waste pit was found full of damaged and otherwise imperfect pottery. Several archaeologists have begun to theorize that a larger pottery enterprise likely existed, but it wasn't until 1970 that a kiln was found. Headed by archaeologist Norman Barca, extensive work uncovered the large site, proving beyond a doubt that a large pottery enterprise existed in pre-revolutionary America. The existence of Rogers' factory is evidence that there were rebellious activities going on in the American colonies long before the French and Indian War and the series of governmental acts that would lead directly to the American Revolution. Many colonists were never on board with this idea that they were supposed to be dependent upon manufactured goods that were only made in England. They demonstrated that they were quite happy to break a law that they thought was unjust, both so that they could buy locally manufactured goods and, of course, so that they could make money. William Rogers and men like him developed a uniquely American economy, frankly one that was necessary if the colonies were ever to break from the mother country. And that same spirit allowed merchants and other well-to-do colonists to oppose England when she started seeking more revenue from the colonies in the 1760s. In a very real sense, the foundations of the American Revolution were made from the clay that Rogers used to make his pottery. The remains of Rogers' factory are now open to the public in Yorktown, now protected by a building built by the National Park Service. Many other museums and locations of historical interest are in Yorktown and in nearby Williamsburg and Jamestown, including the Waterman's Museum, where we learned about the poor potter, along with Yorktown history, on our visit in 2020. It's an extraordinary museum that celebrates the maritime history of the region. Well worth your time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.